This time in the Magic Kitchen, we're talking about familiars, animal familiars, and all the things you may not know about that term with Dodie Graham McKay.
I'm Leandra Witchwood.
And I'm Elyse Wells.
And welcome to the Magic Kitchen podcast, where we talk about magic, kitchen witchcraft, herbs,
and everything in between.
The Magic Kitchen podcast is funded and supported by thewitchwoodteahouse.com, offering a variety of hand-blended loose leaf teas as well as loose herbs for all of your ritual, spell work, wellness, and everyday enjoyment needs. If you would like to support this podcast while sipping a great cup of tea, head over to thewitchwoodteahouse.com and find the magic that's in store for you.
Dodie Graham McKay is an initiated witch and independent filmmaker. Since the 1980s, she has been involved in magic, music, and other forms of media. Dodie is the founder of Moongazy Films, Inc., has written for The Wild Hunt, and is active in her local art and magic communities. You can learn more at dodiegrahammckay.com, and we have that link in the show notes as well. So welcome to the Magic Kitchen.
Yeah, welcome.
Hello, thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. I was excited about this book. I enjoyed it. I can't wait to dig in.
Yeah, we're both pretty deep animal lovers and familiars. We also had Deborah Blake on the show, and we accidentally got to talking about animal familiars in that interview. So some people are probably remembering that one. Yeah, because we're all major cat people on the Magic Kitchen. I think it's just like you describe in the book, A Witch's Ally. Cats are kind of that image when we think of an animal familiar. And it's actually really special because the day that we're recording this, I live in Greece, and in Greece we have a cat colony of like 36 cats, and most of them are feral, but every so often there's a cat or two or three that are just like meant to be in a house. Like they're just unbelievably loving, kind. And we were coming back to the US for an extended visit over the holidays, and there was a cat that I just had a really bad feeling about. I was like, he's not going to make it. And we took him to the vet, and sure enough, he had a kidney disease that he now requires special food for. So he arrived in the US today. We're fostering him for just a week, and then he's going to his forever home to a fellow priestess, actually, that I met through the craft. So it's like unbelievably. Yeah. So it just feels perfect that all this is going down in such a positive way as we're speaking and as I've been reading your book.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations to that kitty cat. That's awesome.
Yeah. Good for Greg.
Yay, Greg.
Is Greg the cat or the foster?
The cat.
I love that. That's perfect.
My husband named him. My husband he's not a witch, but he's very deep with animals. Like when he was growing up, his parents would take in rescue pit bulls and mastiffs. So they would train them and then rehabilitate them for homes. And so he's just always had that gift. And so he met Greg and he said, I don't know why, but his name is Greg. And I was like, I'm not going to question you. I think that's his name.
Well, lucky Greg. I can't imagine what must be going through his kitty cat head to be like a street cat in Greece and now a house cat in the United States. That's pretty wild.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and like watching the snowfall today, and yeah, he's really taking it in.
Should grab him a little bit of snow and see how he reacts to that.
Yeah, I am tempted. Like I almost want to take him outside with a harness, but I'm just too afraid to like somehow weasel out.
Yeah. Okay. So in your book, the very first chapter, you come out with the difference between pets, animal companions, animal familiars. Could you elaborate on that for our listeners so they understand those terms and how you define that in the book?
Well, and yeah, that had to be right off the top in the book because, words are really powerful, and how we use words to describe things is, I mean, that's communication, right? And we want to have clear communication about our ideas. And if we're witches and words are our will, it's really good to have some precision with that. So when I talk about pets, I talk about those animals that live in our environments that, you know, they're awesome. They're family members. They're, you know, our best friends, but they're not necessarily magically inclined. You know, just like Elyse said, you know, her husband isn't a witch, but he's really deep into animals. You know, not every creature, not every person or animal has the, you know, disposition towards witchcraft. And that doesn't make them less. It just makes them different. Some of us are really into witchcraft. Some of us really aren't. So pets would be those animals, you know, that just don't have a leaning towards magic, you know, psychically blind, maybe, you know, but we love them and they're our family. And then when I talk about animal companions, I talk about those animals that do have an aptitude towards magic. And in the book, I set out my dog Oben, who passed away in 2017, as my example of a magical companion. I mean, I always thought I was a crazy cat lady, and then I met him. And I came to understand that I am, in fact, a dog person. I didn't know that before he told me that. But he was a real companion in magic. He had an uncanny ability that was actually a bit startling for people who saw what he would do for the first time. You know, he was a very active participant in circles that would happen at my house. He would, you know, sit in on them and, you know, pace around the circle. And if I had to step out of circle to do something, he would come over and sit in my spot to take my place. And then when I, you know, came back and reclaimed my spot, he would quite often move clockwise around the circle to sit opposite me. You know, he was really kind of watching, engaging what people were doing and sensing energy. So that's kind of an extreme example, but you know, I had a dog in my life that really showed me that kind of relationship is a real possibility. And then when I talk about animal familiars, I'm talking about those animal spirits, you know, maybe spirits of the underworld that are maybe representative of a species or a particular animal, that come to us in that spirit form, you know. No physical bodies required. You know, traditionally and historically, familiars have been recorded as being spirit entities. You know, modern language is a little bit different. We talk about our familiars as being our pets. You know, we have a cat that lives with us, therefore that is our familiar. But if you know, dialing back in time, familiars would have been a spirit entity. So, and not all familiars were animal shaped, right? Some of them were humanoid shaped. So it's good to kind of differentiate animal familiar versus some other kind.
Yeah. And I actually, if this isn't giving away too much in the book, would you be comfortable sharing a bit about the polar bear story that you share? Because I feel like that actually hit home for me, as that is what an animal familiar actually is. Like I never really understood, like I've always wanted what you're describing with Oban, like that connection with an animal who gets magic and wants to be there. And I've been fortunate to meet a familiar once. A friend of mine is a Gardnerian priestess, and I went to an outer court ceremony with her, Coven, and her name's Danny, but she calls her Circle Cat because she literally will tell them when it's time to get into circle. And like she starts the circle like every time. And it was really special. But I've met people who say, like, I've been fortunate in my life to have a strong connection with my spirit guide, but she's a human, 100%. And people have said, oh, my spirit guide's an animal. And I've always kind of not understood what that could mean, because I'm like, well, how are you communicating? But your story about the polar bear sort of shifted that for me.
I don't think it's giving away too much. I will say that it was really, I felt very vulnerable sharing that story in the context of the book, but it's also, I agree, it's a powerful example. And quite frankly, if it hadn't happened to me, I would have found it hard to believe. Right.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge we have when we're dealing with animal familiars or animal companions, is that human beings, even though even though we're witches here in this room right now, like, we tend to believe in things that other people might not. We tend to sense or see things that other people may not. But even then, when something, unusual or supernatural or otherworldly happens to us, it can be like, you're really going out on a limb to disclose that to others, because even other believers may kind of roll their eyes, give you the hairy eyeball, and think you've gone a little bit doolally on that, right? So it's
Sure.
it's a vulnerable thing. So before I put the polar bear story in the book, I really had to sit with it for a while and really think about whether or not I wanted to reveal that much about myself. So now that it's out there, anyway, I've I've worked on a lot of different film projects in my professional career, and I had the opportunity to work for 2.5 years or so on a film project that was filming in the northern parts of Canada. So I live in Winnipeg, which is very close to the Canada-US border. So for me to say, I went north, I went quite far north up to Churchill, and a little bit further north than that on a couple of occasions. And that's polar bear territory. Churchill, Manitoba is a small community of about 800 people on the coast of the Hudson Bay. And it happens to be sort of at the end of a migratory route where polar bears who spend the warmer months inland, mostly sleeping and rolling around, as the ice comes in, usually around Halloween time, as the ice comes in on Hudson Bay, the polar bears all migrate out to the shoreline and wait for the ice to come in. And as soon as they can, they boogie out there on that ice to go hunt seal, which is the most tasty snack ever for a polar bear. It's what they love. The fatty seal is just like so tasty. So we were up there filming at that time of year, and it was interesting, spending a lot of time with local people, talking about bears all the time, and hearing the kinds of stories that people would have about growing up in that community with the constant risk of polar bears rolling through their small town, right? And it was an amazing thing that really struck me, is that local people weren't really necessarily living in fear of the bears, but there was this really healthy respect for the limits and boundaries that the bears needed in order to thrive. And, remarkably, obviously there have been conflicts between people and bears, but remarkably, there's been a pretty healthy truce between them, not hurting each other. And actually, the people are a lot more threatening to the bears than the bears are to the people in reality, right? We're a much more dangerous species.
Sure.
So I was billeted with a very lovely woman that I became friends with, and I was sleeping in her home. And at night, I started to dream about bears. And one night, I had a very, very, very vivid dream about a polar bear that ended with the sound of bear bangers being shot. Now, bear bangers are a type of bullet that make a lot of noise and sparkle when they're fired, and conservation officers will fire bear bangers into the air to frighten polar bears out of the town, so they don't actually shoot the bear, but they shoot these big sparkling noisemakers up, and they're quite loud. And the dream I was having about the bear involved me interacting with the bear and then surrendering to the bear and opening my arms and allowing the bear in my dream to walk right through my body. And that happened, and it was really intense, and it was a very lucid dream. It was very vivid. It was very unlike a normal type of dream, shall we say. But I could sense myself just surrendering to the fact that the bear was going to do with me whatever it wanted to do. And I opened my arms to embrace that opportunity, and the bear walked right through my body. And I could feel it as much as one could imagine feeling a bear walking through their body. Polar bears are very big. I'll have you, you have to understand, these are not cute little teddy bears. These are apex predators, and they're quite big. And then the sound of bear bangers, and I popped awake, and I realized that that had been some kind of dream, but a special kind of dream. And when I popped up and pulled open the curtains above my head and looked out the window, the bear was actually right on the other side of the wall of the building I was sleeping in. So if you measured it with a measuring tape, he was probably within 2 or 3 feet of my sleeping person, but on the other side of the wall. And I got goosebumps telling you this story. But
Me too. I got him all the way up the shoulders.
But after that, I mean, I was up in Churchill for another 2.5 weeks after that night, and I was regularly dreaming about the bears, and I was regularly waking up to the sound of the bear bangers going off in the middle of the night, because I was there at that Halloween time of year when they were migrating and they were coming by. It was quite haunting. And in speaking with people and, becoming good enough friends with some local people, I'm like, hey, I'm kind of freaked out. I had this crazy polar bear dream. And one of my friends up there said, that's normal. Polar bears come to us in our sleep to tell us to watch our boundaries, to give them space. And we grow up here having polar bear dreams. It just means you've been accepted and that they're viewing you in an intimate way. And what I loved about that was that local people who just live close to the land and live with bears in their environments on a regular basis, accept that this is a way that the bear spirit communicates, right? And that this is how the bear tells them, hey, back off,
Right.
Respect the boundaries, I found that really intense. And I didn't go looking for that experience, and I might have overlooked it as just a weird coincidence. But I also have to think as a witch that this is a different type of intelligence's way of communicating. And as cynical human beings and a species that chronically disbelieves, I might have missed that subtlety. Animals in the spirit realm are going to communicate with us on their terms, not ours.
True.
And as witches, we need to be open to nuance and subtlety, and pragmatically look for those hints and clues as to how the spirit of animals and plants and minerals, or whatever for that matter. But that's another book and another show, maybe.
It totally is. I call that being the skeptical believer. So yeah. I will disprove as much as I can in, logical brain. But when you have the local saying, well, yeah, that's how it happens, then yeah, take it.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting way of looking at our relationships with non-human creatures, right? I would argue that just as we have spiritual lives and dream lives and, these kinds of sensations, other living beings will have them too. They will just look really different than ours. And at some point, those bubbles will overlap and we have an opportunity for connection, if we're open to it and if we respect that that's a possibility.
It makes me think of something else you write about, the Umwelt, the idea that the environment, me and Greg, the cat, for example, are in the same environment right now, but his experience of it is completely different than mine because of his abilities. And in the book, what I really loved about that is you actually go through, you talk about echolocation and the animal familiars that people might want to work with, that's their form of communication. Or, what was it called? Magnetoreception, I think.
Yeah.
That one really, really, like, when sometimes you read something and it hits you with just like spirits, like, remember that. I feel like that really spoke to me as a drummer. I in Greece especially, I've been working with the land to try to understand more about the frame drum and its connection to me, it's a connection to magic, but it's more than that. Historically, it's a connection to the cosmos, to the earth, to that connection between cosmos and earth. And it goes back so deep. And one of my drum teachers in Greece talks about the cosmic sound, o kosmikos isikos. And it's the idea that there is a frequency that frame drumming can tap into that animals exist on. And when I'm getting chills again, when I was reading about magnetoreception and you talked about bees, having that awareness of the magnetic field of Earth. My teacher talks about how, and Lane Redmond as well, in When the Drummers Were Women, a book I really recommend to people who are like intently listening to this piece right here. You're called to the drum. So I would recommend that book first and foremost. And bees were, it's purported perhaps that bees might have been the inspiration for why frame drumming sounds the way it does.
Yeah.
And it's also the representation of the first sound in the Big Bang. It's also the understanding of, in the womb, the first sound our ears will hear is our mother's heartbeat. And all of those things, if maybe that is the link, is they're all a reflection of this magnetic field. That
right. And when I hit that point in the book, it made me, the bees were what stood out for me, because in my practice, we do the bee breath, which is, it's a humming resonance that you cycle through as you breathe. So what this does is it not only resets your vagus nerve and your stress point, but it helps you tap into that part of your brain that is uniquely situated for creativity and problem solving and relaxation. And so if you're having trouble thinking, when my students are having trouble thinking, that's what I have them do, bee breath. So it's basically and you can feel it vibrating through your whole system. Like even just that little snippet that I just did, I feel instantly relaxed. And it's amazing that when I hit that point of the book, I was like, whoa, yeah.
Well, I'm glad you guys picked up on that, because I'm always fascinated in those places where science and magic intersect.
Sure.
Sometimes things that were considered magic at one point in history are just now accepted science.
Exactly.
Things about medicine, very medicines that our ancestors used became refined and developed, and now they're sold on pharmacy shelves. There's components to those things that are rooted in something a lot older that would have at one time would have been considered magic, right? So there's those interesting places where we have those intersections between magical things or supernatural things and things that are now just declared science. And the Umwelt theory about how every living creature has its own perception, its own bubble of reality around it. And that, you and Greg the cat sitting in the room together, you're sitting in the same physical space, but what Greg can see and hear and smell and detect, and what you can see and hear and smell and detect are not the same, right? So what can understanding Greg's perception teach you about what's happening around you? Following his clues might give you a richer experience of sitting in that room today, right? I mean, we've all had that experience with a cat where suddenly they're staring into a corner and then they jump straight up in the air and bolt out of the room. What's that all about? I don't think that they're necessarily trying to scare you or mess with your head, although cats are pretty sassy. Maybe they are. But, that's it. Did your cat just hear a sound you can't hear? Did it pick up on something in a light frequency that's beyond what we can see? Right? And is it interacting with that in a way that you're not going to understand because you don't have those senses? The world is a lot more magic than what our human abilities give us. So, tapping into that animal intelligence is a way of expanding our horizons.
In just 2 weeks from today, I will be welcoming a group of people on the priestess path to the sacred lands of Delphi. This is not a getaway. You, too, will walk the same sacred ground where the oracle once spoke, where priestesses channeled divine wisdom, and where your own intuition will come alive. You will experience daily rituals, guided meditations at sacred sites, intuitive activation through deep connection with the sisters in our circle. And you will deepen your connection with spirit and your guides in ways that you may not realize are possible
If you've been waiting for a clear yes from the universe, this is it. Join us at Delphi. Check availability for remaining spots at seekingnumina.com/Delphi retreat or visit the link in the show notes.
That's why you read this book. That's why I would recommend it to people who are drawn to animal magic. Animal medicine, I should say, really. It's like how to take it in. And you do have, I would say that's one of my favorite parts is in this book, you have journeys. They're not necessarily the workings. Like I'm working on my book right now, Sacred Wild. That's actually, by the time this comes out, it'll probably maybe even have a cover to share. But at this point, it's like, we're still in Vision 2 edits. And that's the big thing is like, I have too many exercises, too many little ones, too many, like you did such an incredible job in this book of really getting to the meat of it. Like these are the exercises that they're more than an exercise. They're a journey. Like I love that you use that word for it to connect to animals and to experience in a way their Umwelt.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an idea I love to work with. And it also makes me wonder, like sort of taking the whole Umwelt theory and extrapolating it across, the underworld and the upper world. Like what happens, what's going on for animals? What is their experience of the richness of life going to be like from their perspective? And knowing that, if you have a dog in the physical world here in the middle world and that dog dies, like my beloved dog Oben did, then what? Is he still inherently a dog in the spirit world? I think so. I'm going to, our as human beings, there's a general acceptance that if you believe in an afterlife, you're generally going to retain your human characteristics in the afterworld. And then it makes me think about extinction. What happens to the Umwelt of an animal? What happens to that sensory perception of the world that an animal species has when that species ceases to exist? Right?
Wow. Yeah.
Like talk about a tear in the tapestry of life. Talk about a warping of that web of life, when you have an entire, species of creatures. Like I'm thinking the dodo bird, maybe it's because my name is Dodie and I get called that sometimes, but, is there, what happens to all that perception? What happens to that richness when we lose something like that? And as a witch thinking that way, it makes me consider life on earth so much more sacred and precious,
Yeah.
And I don't want that to be a oppressive or depressing thought, but it does speak to the fact that our responsibility to look after this planet extends beyond the visible world. It extends into the sacred realms and the spiritual realms.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to do a lot of thinking about that after our conversation today about extinct animals. Something that's been on my mind for the past, like, maybe 7 or 8 months is I learned about 7 or 8 months ago that almost 100% of insects are endangered on this earth. I didn't know that. I knew that certain ones were, but I didn't know it was like straight up across the board globally. And when I learned that, I've just consciously shifted how I see insects. Like I see them as precious, finite resources now. And so like since then, it's been interesting. People don't think of insect medicine that way, but we do think of bee medicine. We do think of spider medicine. So maybe it's not so far-fetched, to think of, I don't even know their names, like woolly bear caterpillars, for example. Like I was with my husband on a walk and we've been trying to do, while we're in the US, we're in Amish country and there's lots of hills. And so we've been trying to like do more mileage on our walks to like, get fit, like, things like that. And he's like tracking with his Apple Watch. He's like, okay, we did 18 minutes on that mile. Let's see if we can do better. And we both had a lesson in like, we need to slow down for this planet sometimes because we were coming around this one bend and it's a trucking route through here. So I had that in my mind. And we saw 5 woolly bear caterpillars and they're just slowly crossing the street. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but we have to help these guys make it. And then as I stood there, more started coming. Like they must have been like, oh, good, the crossing guard's here. Like, and so like we're just ushering these guys across the street. And then, of course, a truck actually comes. And so then I have like this really awkward situation of like, now there's a guy who's like, what's this lady doing? And I get them all across the street. And I look, and the truck is like, really, like, what is she doing? Like, I think he figured out there must be an animal, but I'm sure he couldn't see these little caterpillars from up there. And then I like give him a very warm smile, like, thank you. And then he moves through. And I look at my husband and he's like, you are so funny. Like, those are caterpillars. And I said, yeah, but you know that they're endangered. I just know they're endangered because almost all of the insects are. I don't have to Google it. Like, I trust that was the right thing to do. And he's like, yeah, we can get our mile tomorrow. And I was like thinking to myself, like, but maybe those caterpillars couldn't have. Like, I'm glad we took that time. Yeah. Just something for the listeners too. Like, really think about your relationship to insects and even like neem oil. Like I see people, I'm not a gardener, but I know people, especially in Pennsylvania, with these invasive species of insects that are killing our insects. Those are definitely, if we're meant to kill them, unfortunately, maybe we should, but that's nature. It does get brutal sometimes. But people are like, oh, use neem oil because it will kill what are they called? Lantern flies? The invasive guys? I don't live here during the spring and summer months. So I always forget what they are, but people are always like worried about them. And they're like, oh, use neem oil. It's natural. But neem oil kills a lot of our natural insects that we need. So it's nuanced. Again, as witches, this is another unfortunate mundane way we have to be aware of nuance.
The spotted lanternfly in Pennsylvania, because I know a lot of our listeners are from this area, nurture the praying mantises. They are the only one that will eat the spotted lanternfly as well as the invasive stink bugs. So just a little tidbit, there's natural ways to manage these ecosystems. In my neighbors, I know, get upset with me because I don't clean up my leaf litter. I leave it because so many species overwinter in that. And since we've moved here, I've been here for 20 years, a little more than 20 years. Since we've moved here, the firefly the population has dwindled completely. Like you almost don't see them anymore. And it's all because everybody here is so obsessed with their pesticides, their herbicides. So in my yard, I make it that mission of my own. And, we can do that in our own personal yards too. I don't take care of my leaf litter. I don't use pesticides. I don't use herbicides. I'm pretty much like let it grow wild. So I'm sure my neighbors appreciate that.
And that's the thing, like the worst thing that's going to happen if you leave your leaves on your lawn is you'll have richer soil and better wildlife. That's it. Right?
Absolutely.
We are so obsessed with these sterile golf putting green like lawns. Yes. And it's I can't wait for that tide to turn and people to start looking at it as an eyesore. Right?
Yeah.
It's one step away from being a desert, really.
Yeah, and in Greece it's not a thing. Like there's just not enough water, at least in my region of Greece, to water a lawn, and so people wouldn't even think to do it. Like, it's just a totally different way of thinking. They're like, oh, well, there's not enough water, so why would I do that? In the States, it's like, I'll figure it out. It's my right to have the lawn. Like, it is.
I'll install the sprinkler system.
We just had the longest drought in an over 200-year period in Pennsylvania. And I still saw people having fires despite the burn ban. I still saw, it's unconscionable and more jarring to me the longer I live outside of the U.S. But on a positive note, I do know quite a few local Pennsylvania businesses that are doing like native plant landscaping. Like people don't know what to do themselves, so they can actually just call in a company. So no matter where you live, if you are ready to do that step, listeners, I guarantee there is somebody. Go to your local Facebook marketplace, go to your groups on, next door, like you will find somebody. And they're not as expensive as traditional landscapers so far, in my experience.
Well, and if as witches, we want to live close to nature and foster environments for nature to flourish. If you have custody of a patch of land that you're taking care of, why not create a habitat for animals? Why not put out some bird feeders? Why not put out some kind of water source for animals? I mean, the richness that it brings to your life to do that little bit of stewardship, it's a small thing. My husband is the king of feeding migratory birds, and we have a collection of haphazard looking bird baths. We don't spend a lot of money on fancy, bird baths from a garden center. We've got a collection of big, giant plant saucers, like you'd put under a giant plant pot, that we fill with water and weigh down with some rocks so birds or bees can sit on the rocks and drink. And as a result, we see all kinds of creatures come through
That's
our
wonderful.
yard. And it's a real gift. There's a colony of deer that have inhabited and moved in to our neighborhood. And, any given evening, we're going to see the deer come to drink out of the bird feeders. I mean, water is something universal that life needs to exist, and giving that gift of water to your local wildlife, even if your local wildlife is just, a few insects that are hanging on, that gift of water is enough. It's something that you can give usually just by turning on a tap or letting some rain collect. It is a gift. It is a serious offering. So,
Yeah.
and you don't have to spend a lot of money or have a lot of, resources to provide.
If you're a serious practitioner teetering on the cusp of progress, it's time to step into true spiritual mastery. This is your invitation to join the Gardens of the Mystic Initiation and Certification Program, where I offer practitioners like you advanced teachings and guided experiences. Sign up now at leandrawitchwood.com or find the link in the show notes to learn more. Embrace your higher calling. Your journey awaits.
So we've spoken a lot about animals and animal familiars. One thing I didn't want to miss talking about is how fairies and familiars are connected through history. Yes. Could you speak to that a little bit? Tell our listeners about the connection.
Well, it was something that I kind of fell sideways into. Like the wonderful thing about writing books is that it usually gives you an opportunity to slide down about 1 million rabbit holes of learning. And in parts of the world and in cultures where traditions of fairies, existed, and the idea that there were, fair folk living under hills or, in wooded areas, it really primed the pump for that idea of different types of familiars, not just animal familiars. It almost seemed like a natural progression that if you already have a belief system that includes the fairy realm, your mind is already open and receptive to the idea that sure, that these familiar types of creatures, of spirit beings, can also exist. So yeah, that was one of the interesting rabbit holes I definitely slid down. I really expected this book to be a lot more about that science magic intersection. Because my background working in documentary film and doing a lot of natural history types of projects, my natural mind was open to that kind of information. And I don't come from a culture necessarily that has an inherent belief in fairies and fair folk. But, historically and in European cultures where that would have been just a given, you think of Ireland with its rich fairy traditions and histories, it's parts of Scotland and Britain. Doesn't it feel natural that would evolve and expand to include the idea of spirit familiars, whether they're humanoid type or of no distinguishable shape or distinctly animal shape? I love that. And the thought that those kinds of entities could also inhabit, that's another part of the familiar legend, is that these spirits could inhabit bodies either through possession or by manifesting in those shapes. A familiar that takes the shape of a cat might be some kind of spirit that possesses the cat, or it might be a spirit that takes the form of a cat. Yeah, if you've got a culture that's already rife with fairy stories and fairy lore, why not? It's a natural thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me think of and you talk about it in the book too, like the genius. The Romans worked with the genius, which was like an actual it wasn't ourselves. Like it's interesting how that word, like you were saying in the beginning of the interview, like modern word usage is so different. But
Yeah,
originally the genius wasn't something within us. It was something we were gifted with from without. And in ancient Rome, that was something they would intentionally work with. And it's amazing to me how that evolved as well, like from ancient Greece we worked with the well, this is still actually a Latin word, but the genii loci. In Greek, that word doesn't seem to exist in English very often, but like the Greek word would be stichia, like the elemental presences of a place or the spirits of place, essentially. And I've often thought of them that way, like the nymphs especially, like they tend to inhabit either like a dryad for a particular tree, like an oak tree is a traditional dryad, but you also might run into um I'm thinking actually my name comes from Elyse is like a long derivative of Elyse, which is the willow nymph. So like you can it then starts bridging into plant spirits, like the way we
Mhm.
can have a spirit familiar that is a plant or a tree. Many people feel they have a special tree that connects with them.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, lots
And
of
isn't it
ancient
interesting?
precedents.
Well, and isn't it interesting that across cultures there is some version of this idea?
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
if around the world everybody is kind of picking up on the same resonances, doesn't
Collective
it
consciousness.
sort of feel true? You know?
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes.
For sure.
Syncretism, like studying syncretism has given me so much more confidence to, like, especially in a public forum, like a podcast, to just speak to this is like, yeah, here's my sources, even if it all comes back down to personal gnosis of the ancients, somehow when it's an ancient person, we trust it a little better.
Well, I like to think, our ancestors were smart and had an intelligence equal to our own, but the technology was different. And
Exactly.
if all of these stories time and time again keep coming up true, keep coming up as believed and relevant to our ancestors and to various cultures, I mean,
Yeah.
it's part of the human story. It's part of who we are.
Yeah, that
you know
longevity.
yeah,
I love it.
I love it too. I really
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah. And I grew up hearing stories. My grandparents were Cherokee, but we're also Irish and Scottish and Welsh. So I grew up getting the mix of the stories, the old world and new world stories type um, mix. So the idea that plant spirits and animal spirits exist, it was always there, even though I didn't identify with it as a younger self, was that being that spiritual thing. It was just something that we did. We talked to our animals from the time I was a child. We would talk to our animals, and if they understood us, cool. And it always seemed like they did. So yeah, there's definitely that intelligence there and that longevity in these stories.
It's one of those things when cultures lose that animistic view of the world, when we stop seeing the spirit and divinity and light inherent in all creation, when we stop valuing the individuality of other non-human creatures, that's when we get into trouble, right? That's when we have forests that get clear cut and land masses that get blown up and extracted for resources. When we lose that sense of the sacred as a community, we start to lose the planet, right? When so I think, and I'm sitting on my soapbox, beating my drum, screaming, animism is the only thing that's going to save this planet. When
It's so
humanity
true.
when humanity as a whole kind of stops and takes a breath and goes, oh shit, this is sacred, what are we doing? Then we're going to make progress. But as long as we still think as a human race that we have dominion over the elements of this planet, we're not going to be successful. We're not going to thrive.
Yeah.
So it's nice to hear these kinds of concepts coming up in some communities as like for discourse, it's a good thing. Hopefully it'll spread.
Yeah, I feel it is. I like my work these days is primarily with the land, like land spirits, spirits of place that can be found, helping people know that they're there so that they can go out and start fostering those relationships. Like my business is Seeking Numina. Numina means sacred places. And originally it was with that idea of like in Greece, I take people to sacred sites, I do tours, I host retreats. So that was kind of the original idea of it, was like taking people to sacred places. And then as it's grown, it's been a recognition that actually every single place on this earth is sacred because there's a spirit of that place and it's waiting for us to connect to it. And it's amazing to me the people that are called to this work. Like sometimes I'll be talking to somebody that's like a family friend, like somebody who's been in our life, maybe even through church as a kid or something. And they'll say something like, I was looking at your page and it actually made me think, and they're getting this little tingling, this little call. And I think it's the land itself. I think it's actually almost that simple in some cases where, somebody goes for a long walk or they do have a bird feeder or they, start setting up some native plants so that bees have something to pollinate in their yard. And it's a small act like that that starts the ball rolling. And then there's a relationship that starts being built. And then I hope this is going is it will, like you said, just ripple out into the general consciousness, the overculture to
Mhm.
to just have a bit of animism. I don't need everybody to be as animistic as the three of us are, but if they can just have it somewhere in their approach to life,
Yeah.
we wouldn't be where we are as a species and the destruction we're causing.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true. And, a lot of people, and in writing A Witch's Ally, I talked to a lot of people about their relationships with animals, and almost everyone has had some experience in their life with an animal that was to them remarkable or special, right? Not everybody grew up having pets. Not everybody grew up in a rural area where they were exposed to farm animals or whatever. But almost everybody I've ever spoken to has had some kind of connection with an animal, even if it was just in a fleeting moment. And I think if we created opportunities for people to have conversations about what that feels like and what that means, if we allowed people to explore those spiritual feelings, like, and I'm not talking about pagan communities, it's like preaching to the choir, right?
Yeah.
We're all going to agree with each other on certain things. But I'm talking about in the overculture, in the wider world. If we had space for people to have those, sort of vulnerable moments where we talk about our polar bear experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the acceptance of that, the acceptance of looking at animals. Animals are something that a lot of people see just as a food source,
Yeah.
or as a pest.
Yeah.
You
Or a
know,
commodity.
yeah, yeah. It's the way, particularly in Western cultures, the way we viewed animals as something that don't have feelings, don't have, emotions, don't feel pain. Once
Mhm.
once we've been able to strip the identity out of the animal kingdom, it's a lot easier to exploit.
Right.
I think if everybody was in a position where they had an opportunity to see the individuality and the specialness of the creatures around us, I think we'd have a lot more vegetarians, and I think we'd have a lot more of a respectful shift towards valuing every creature's place on the planet and seeing that we're all part of an ecosystem, that we all need each other for ensured survival.
Yeah.
But maybe that's too big for some folks to even consider right now, because it thinking that way would upset too many people's personal apple carts.
Yeah,
But
it does. It upsets that and creates that cognitive dissonance where they can't grasp the new idea, and then it sends people into a tailspin until they're ready to accept. But
yeah,
I agree with that. I agree that all animals have their own little personalities. Even looking at my own little cats, my two little crazy minions. Molly and Midnight. They are two very different cats. They look similar because they're both black cats. So if you're not familiar with them, they look almost exactly the same. But like Molly, I always call her the derpy one. She's kind of the pretty dumb one. And then Midnight, she's the tank. She's the one that you don't mess with. She's the one that she's going to catch the mouse for you. And she's going to demand the pet. So actually on Instagram, I tagged you in it. There's a picture of her. I was trying to read the book and take my notes. And she did you see it? She literally stepped up on me and looked at me like, excuse me, this is my time, not book time. So, but that's her attitude.
Let me tell you something about cats. You never notice how a cat will always try to sit on whatever it is you're reading.
Mm-hmm.
I have a theory that cats read with their buttholes. So when
there it is.
So this is the revelation I've brought to this podcast today, and that's what everybody's going to remember.
Okay. That's the takeaway.
That's the takeaway.
When a cat sits on a book, they are absorbing the knowledge.
Absolutely. That's why I got my cats their own little like computer. It's one of those scratching post computers because they kept trying to lay on my computer. So
yeah. Just trying to absorb the information. That's how they do it. That's how they do it.
Yes. Perfect.
It's finally time. My book, Sacred Wild, An Invitation to Connect with Spirits of the Land, is now available for pre-order. Pre-orders are the #1 key to a book success. They help Sacred Wild reach more readers and even bestsellers lists. If you love the Magic Kitchen podcast, this is a great way to support my work. Pre-order now at seekingnumina.com/preorder. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, Dodie, thank you for joining us on the Magic Kitchen. Would you have any final parting thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners who are interested in, I guess, in animal familiars, since that ended up being mostly what we chatted about today?
Well, we talked about a lot about environmentalism too. I always encourage folks, if you're going to do one thing, to sort of try to expand your compassion and empathy and sympathy with the natural world, is grow something. It doesn't matter if it's a geranium in a pot on your windowsill or planting a tree. Just plant something and take care of it and pay attention to it. If you have an affinity for an animal, if you think that there's like a particular animal that is cool and that you want to learn about, learn everything you can about that animal. Learn about how they perceive the world. Learn about what their special abilities that we don't share, what they might be. Take some time in quiet to observe the patterns that you have around you in your natural environment. Nothing has to cost money. Right. Not everything has to be through social media. Go outside, take a look around, pay attention to the birds that come through your community at different times of the year. Find out what kind of bugs live in the grass near your home. It's a small way to connect, but it opens the door to the umwelt of those creatures and the magical potential for you to learn and be a richer and more rounded out witch.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, take care of something other than ourselves.
Yeah, crazy idea, but it works.
Crazy. Well,
so can you tell our listeners? Yeah, it was great. I'm excited to listen to this again closer to release, because it is always so special to revisit these conversations, especially like this one comes out months later. So it's going to be good to have that space to listen to it.
This is great.
Tell our listeners where they can find your work, your website, your Instagram, any of the places that they can keep up with you.
Connect with you, yeah.
Sure. Well, if you find me on my website, dodiegrahammckay.com, you can find most of the short films I've made available there for streaming, and you can just watch them and hopefully enjoy them. I've got 2 books out, Earth Magick, which is part of the Elements of Witchcraft series, and that's a big deep dive into the earth element with, all the green and growing things that entails. And my most recent book, A Witch's Ally, just came out in September 2024, for the sake of marking time. Yeah, so if you love animals, if you think you might love animals, if you want some help building some vocabulary around maybe a special or spiritual experience you've had with animals, either from the spirit realm or in our physical realm, maybe that book will help you expand that, or at least get some vocabulary around these things that we're feeling and doing. On Instagram, I am Dodie_GM, and I post a lot of pictures of my dogs. I post my witchcraft and writing adventures on there. That's a good place to find me. I also have a spell candle business, Coven Candle Company, and you can find stuff about that on my website, and also on what is my URL, my handle for Covenstead Candles, Covenstead_candle_co on Instagram. So if you want to see beautiful spell candles, there you go.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I also have to just advocate for both of your books. Earth Magick is cited a lot in Sacred Wild, and A Witch's Ally was a delight. Like, from my personal practice, I have a lot to go back into with this book. It's a good one.
Awesome. Well, that's wonderful to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us. This was a great conversation. I'll talk about animals any day.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, you guys. It's been really nice to hang out.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Merry meet,
Merry part, and merry meet again.
Thank you for joining us on the Magick Kitchen podcast. Please visit my website, leandrawitchwood.com, for news, information, and more episodes.
I'm Elyse Wells, and I can be found at Seeking Numina on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and seekingnumina.com. That's Seeking, Numina.